Welcome to Fated, a podcast brought to you by Magella and Carly, two romantasy-obsessed readers who believe that great books must include declarations of undying love and deep thrusts of desire. Diving into the spicy, smutty fantasy genre, we are here for both the rattling of stars and headboards, and our podcast starts with the worlds of SJM, but delves into other realms. Did we mention that washboard abs and wands of all kinds are welcome in this inclusive and magically charged space? No topic is off limits, and no one is forced to have only one favourite heroine. Welcome to Fated, where we are unabashedly and wholeheartedly hot and heavy for spicy fantasy fiction. It's time to sit down and smut up. Warning, spoilers ahead. I'm Carly, and welcome to episode 3 of Fated, the podcast. Today we are going to have a really interesting conversation about what is fantasy romance, what even is that genre, because I know that a lot of our listeners, I think, will be very, very new to it and be wondering, well, what makes it a romance novel? What makes it a fantasy novel? What makes it a fantasy romance? So excited to have that conversation today, but first I'd love to ask Madge, what are you reading at the moment? Well, I think like many people in who are in Book Talk land, I am deep in Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros, the sequel to Fourth Wing. Carly has not begun it yet, so I can't talk about it at all. I'm at 57%, and I am struggling to stop or slot life in around it, and that will be I will talk about that more when we speak in a future episode about, is reading a drug? Can you become addicted to reading?
So when did it come out? And you're at what, 57%? When did it come out?
It came out yesterday.
Amazing. Impressive. Incredible.
And I still went to bed at a very normal time and woke up at a normal time. I just think I've sacrificed mostly everything else.
Yeah, as I wish I could. So I have huge FOMO and I'm avoiding social media at the moment. So it is a huge release for those who have not yet read Fourth Wing. It is a huge release. It has been much anticipated, and the community is going wild. So yeah, I have it en route in the post, and I think that it's going to come next Monday, which is in, a few days' time, which will give me time to finish what I'm reading, which is Assassin's Blade. And yes, it sounds like I've been reading that forever, but we only recorded those last podcast episodes a few days ago. Loving it. And I'm also listening to the audiobook of Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So I do listen to and read other genres, and in particular, I like to listen to other genres on audio. Fantasy romance for me, I think I've previously said as well, I do like to read sitting down with the book in my hands so I can really immerse myself in the world and the world building and the characters and the story, to be totally swept up by it. I struggle to read fantasy romance audio-wise or listen to it audio-wise. So that's what I'm reading and listening to at the moment. So let's dive in to what is fantasy romance, because I was a bit confused at the start when I jumped into this genre. I don't know about you, Madge, but I was like, is it what makes it fantasy? Because isn't every fiction fantasy?
Yes, I remember we did have this discussion, and I felt like I didn't have that same kind of hesitation, because I think I don't really care about labels. So it's an interesting thing of like, what is romantasy? The actual label doesn't draw me in at all. It's more like, what will this book make me feel? Or what will this kind of genre make me feel? And I do feel like fantasy, it doesn't feel like, it's so interesting because fantasy to me sits closer to sci-fi. And I guess that hadn't ever really been appealing. I'm not really a sci-fi kind of gal. I do enjoy a good science fiction movie, but I've never really delved into the sci-fi reading world. And on top of that too, I don't think I have ever really kind of felt like I was a romance reader. There was a lot of derision around being a romance reader. I don't know if it was the same for you growing up. It was something of our generation, or but there was so much, I guess, judgment about the Mills and Boon era, and reading these kind of trashy romance novels, that it was something that it was almost like, as someone who grew up reading a lot and then writing a lot and always being really good at English, I guess there was definitely, we were encouraged to be very academic. So there was this almost, I guess, holding back from embracing, something that could be as sort of lowbrow or tawdry as, that sort of stereotypical romance genre, which was like, talk down to women, and, didn't kind of bring in that independence and that kind of intellect that we were now priding ourselves on. Whereas I think romantasy, for me, doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like that Mills and Boon romance, and it doesn't feel like fantasy / sci-fi. It really feels like this very unique genre that has cherry-picked these elements from a few different genres, but it has kind of created this outcome that feels more epic.
Yeah. Do you think?
What do you think?
Like legitimate, like I don't know. The word that came to mind when you were speaking is like it adds a legitimacy. Like there's some more complexity and robustness and detail to this romance, so it's more, I don't know, as you said, maybe acceptable or intellectual or something. It adds something else, another element to it.
Like it's more like a novel that's worthy of our time, because it's going to take us on a journey and teach us life lessons, and we're going to laugh and cry and rail with these characters, which you may not associate with reading lighthearted romance, or I guess a real typical escapism type fantasy sci-fi. And it's a really interesting thing and I think we should definitely find out what all our listeners think about. Do they have judgment? Have their friends judged them for this romantasy genre? Do they label it as romantasy? Do they just call it romance? Do they call it fantasy? Do they not label it at all, and they just talk about these books that they're reading by title? Like interesting how everyone is kind of categorizing themselves.
My nature is to then go, okay, well, let me go find out. Let's look on the internet. Let's look at how other people are seeing these books, experiencing these books, and what actually is it. So I'm like, on good old Google, like, what is romantasy, or what is, it's romantic fantasy, also known as romantasy. And so this is what I kind of found when I was doing a little bit of search. Like, it's a literary genre that seamlessly combines the elements of romance and fantasy. At its core, though, it explores the depths of love, passion, and relationships against the backdrop of fantastical settings. And then there's this like spectrum. So these settings can range from really high fantasy realms, I guess, like what we've seen in, the most popular books at the moment with the ACOTAR series, Sarah J. Maas's Worlds and Fourth Wing and the like, to like filled with magic, filled with mythical creatures, to low fantasy worlds with really subtle fantastical elements. A little bit, I guess, like how I was talking about Outlander as well. Outlander still has that fantasy element of going back in time, but it's going back into a historical realm that actually existed. So there's this spectrum, which was really interesting. And I guess I would assume that readers will find themselves on that spectrum, like whether they enjoy all of it, or whether like I actually really prefer being pulled completely into a completely created world or not. What sets romantasy apart is that the central external conflict in these stories is typically a romance between two main characters. So you can have fantasy books on their own, but romantic fantasy absolutely has this central conflict between these characters, these romantic stories. And that I got a lot of that information from a website called legendsandlore.com, which was really, really cool to discover. But there's a lot of world building, isn't there, in these fantasy books, as you said, a lot of world building. And so it is that fantasy element for me is so much more intriguing than just a romance story set in real life. What do you reckon? Do you read romance? Because do you read normal romance too, like just regular romance now? Are you interested in that or not?
I mean, I feel like it should appeal, because what I find so irresistible about this genre of books, the romantasy, is the central love stories, is the fated characters, is the, kind of like bottomless, loyalty and love and devotion that brings them together across realms, across worlds, across all obstacles. So one would assume then that I would also find just a standard romance to also be appealing, because again, it is also built around two characters. But there is something about the displacement of reality. So we're not in today's world. So perhaps it's that if we tried to picture love like these characters have in our world today, it seems improbable and implausible. So then we can't connect, or there's a part of our brain that says that just would never happen. It's just not possible. But also, in one of Sarah J. Maas's series, Crescent City, it is set in an urban environment where they have laptops and mobile phones. So it is a modern day.
I found some web results. I can show them if you ask again from your iPhone.
Siri wants to be involved in this podcast. Hey Siri, stop.
Let me just do a marker and we'll just edit that out.
I'm like, good to know. I've just unplugged Siri. Siri has been banished.
You are not invited.
So that's right. Crescent City.
Just a sec. Okay. Go.
So Crescent City is an interesting concept in a way, because it is set in a world that is much more similar to ours, where there is phones and laptops and high-rise buildings and lots of conveniences that we know because we use them and they're in our current world. But there is still beings that have wings, and there's mermen, and there's lots of different creatures, and so it still feels set in a fantasy realm. It still feels like it's far away from our norm, and I'm not sure if it's that aspect that allows me to then connect. Like there's a part of me then that relaxes and says, I'm just going to go with this love story because it's not set in our world, so I can believe fully in it, that it is possible and it could happen. But if it's in a romance, it asks me to believe that is possible in my current world, with the way we live and the way we interact with people, but also that when it's set in a typical environment that we know, there is this aspect of, but I don't have that. Like if you are reading a romance where the main character has fallen in love with a 6'6" man with chiseled abs and, like a beautiful tattoo down his back, and he's, incredibly good looking, and, it's sort of a bit like, and he goes wild in the bedroom, but he's also very protective and loyal and, cooks you dinner. It would become, there is a little comparison that begins, because it's like, well, should that be what my relationship is? Should that be what my partner is? Like, have I picked wrong? Yeah. Are these men out there?
And fantasy really, I guess, asks the reader to let go. And if you don't love fantasy romance, then it could be because you just, for you, it's like, it's too far fetched, and you're not willing to let go of reality as much as those of us who are just like, happy to discard reality completely and here we go into this world. Very, very cool. And it was interesting reading as I was researching as well about, as a writer of fantasy romance, like you have to cover 2 genres, potentially more if it's also got some historical elements in there. It can be, I can imagine it would be really difficult to balance those genres. You've got to have enough world building and character complexity and plot beats to move that story forward, and weaving of stories and connecting dots, and also hit the beats of a romance novel. So if you've ever read or you've written romance yourself, you know that there's beats of the storyline that are pretty much universal across romance. So I just think quite amazing in this genre that to have to balance that out and weaving the romance into the larger tapestry of the plot, and figuring out not only their human characteristics or non-human characteristics or character traits, but also then literally creating the world. Literally creating the world. Like, what kind of magic exists here? What kind of creatures? What kind of buildings? How does it look? There's so much, isn't it? It's quite incredible as a writer to be able to do that.
And also, I think it's really important to remember that when people really like something or become obsessed, they reread, they scroll for details, they're going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. And the writers that have become the most successful, there's this, underneath everything, there is this level of accuracy and dependability where all of the facts always line up, and there isn't gaping holes in plausibility in terms of this seems to make sense and this family tree matches up here and this being can do these things but not those things, and that stays consistent through all the types of beings who are like that across timelines, and and how they interact with different characters. And so I think with that, it's not just that they've created this other world, but they've created this other world that is very appealing. I think you can have fantasy worlds where you just don't want to go there. Like, you're like, hey, that's really, wow, that's intense, or that sounds epic or something. But these worlds, the way the authors often talk about, the landscape, the buildings, the architecture, the history, the culture. I mean, I do sound a bit like a super fan now because I'm like, oh my God, the culture that they, like, the folklore that they're telling around the fireplace, but it is that level of detail.
Yeah.
And then I think that this is not related anything to romantasy, but the fact that then we have fan art and people creating what they think the characters and the places look like, then adds this visual layer to the imagination version, like your imagined version of it. So it starts to feel more and more real, which then adds to that connection that you're forging with the characters, the place, the story.
Oh my gosh, Magella, I was sitting there reading Assassin's Blade yesterday, and I highlighted a paragraph that was just the Sarah J. Maas explaining or describing the view down the road of what she could see down the street. And I read it like 5 times. I'm like, how is she describing that so wonderfully that I am so compelled to highlight that and reread it? It was quite amazing. And when you were, talking about, just to circle back a bit, about how they meticulously, weave everything together for the detectives that are going to go back and reread, they also leave space for the conspiracy theory, the foreshadowing, there's still enough space in there for people to make up their own ideas about what's coming in the next book or what's going to happen to this character and how this is going to develop, which is quite talent. Like that's quite remarkable. That takes talent, doesn't it? It's quite
yes, and also what has been really entertaining to watch in that about that is that there's a bit of a trend going through TikTok where readers will give the book to their partners who are, let's say, skeptical of how much they're going to enjoy it. And there's a little bit of a condescending energy of like, I'm going to be able to predict what happens. This is so obvious. This person's, because the person who's filming this has asked their partner to sort of talk them through the book as they're reading it. What is this character? What do you think is going to happen next? And this person, often these husbands usually are saying, oh, so obvious. This person's going to end up here. And sometimes they're right, but more often than not, suddenly they're like, I did not see that. Oh my God, did they just kill that? What? Wow, So there is always these, I guess, plot twists or, yes, character deaths that you're not prepared for, or a development that, yes, comes out of the left side. You're a little bit blindsided by it.
To it as well sometimes, this suspense of, and some of the books do just literally stop and leave you going, what the F? What? And now I've got to wait 9 months for another addition to this sequel, another sequel to this book. Yeah. So you've got the beats of romance, you've got the fantasy world building. I was also like, what makes it a sci-fi fantasy, what makes it a romance fantasy? And it literally, all I could find was if it's set in space, makes it a sci-fi, and if it's not. So, but I can imagine you could have a fantasy romance set in space. Anyway, we could go on and on about all the genres, but that was really interesting to me. What else did I get in my notes here?
Have you talked about the different types of love stories that go through it? Like, there seems to be, if it doesn't tick one of these, I guess, versions of a love story, people really expect that. They often talk about forbidden lovers or the slow burn or they're not destined, but they are destined. But at the beginning, they hate each other and you think they would be terrible together. And there's often a romance before that. It's got a name. The first love, I guess you could call it, not end game. Yeah, and sometimes those loves feel beautiful, but they just weren't the end. They weren't the big end game love, and sometimes they were the wrong person. You've ended up dating a villain. Oops.
The longer I read this genre, the more books I read, I remember the innocence and naivety of myself at the start when I thought that first love was it. And now I'm really like, oh no, you're the first love. You'll be gone soon. Or like something's going to happen to you, or you are actually evil, or, I'm now like, nah, you're not obviously it. It's too early in the book, which is really, really fascinating. So yes, we've got like enemies to lovers or rivals to lovers is a common one. Forbidden love, which is, romantic relationship hindered by something social, cultural, it's forbidden by their families, or there's some supernatural barriers like, fae and human. Can that happen? Well, yes, we can make that happen, can't we, Sarah? Taboo love, forbidden love. So, obviously the classic, Romeo and Juliet kind of story that we've all loved over many, many, many decades is now being brought into fantasy. You've got the theme of mates, so characters who are destined to be together, often with a magical or supernatural connection. That's another trope. We've seen that. We see that with Feyre and Rhysand. Is it Aelin and Rowan? I haven't met them yet, but apparently that's another. Magella's, if you're not watching the video, Magella's like, yes, I can't wait for you to meet them, Carly. And the other classic trope is love triangle. So a central character is torn between two potential love interests, which is interesting. Have you read any of that, love triangle, where the female main character is being torn? I mean, there's fourth wing, I guess, but also not.
There is, and in Crescent City, you haven't got there yet, but there is a couple of characters that sort of create a little bit of that. And it's interesting because Crescent City is only 2 out of 3 done, and then, apparently with SJM, she's crossing the series. So that's, they will all the characters will start colliding in the later books across timelines and across different realms.
Cool.
And certain people who don't have a mate in their current series is because they're actually meant to be mating with someone in a different book series, which is wild in a way. But it is also so comforting as a reader, because these are, in every series of SJMs, you become very attached to characters. And so the fact that these characters could also meet other characters that you love, and that worlds start colliding, and that someone's lineage has actually given them the gift that they've got, and that came from a character that you loved, and you didn't realize that the timelines were like that because they've been set in different worlds. So that's really interesting. But I do feel like the love triangle hasn't been as present in a serious love triangle, not the same way as it was, I guess, in Twilight, where there was Bella and Edward and the wolf, werewolf, Jacob.
And in
and
games, you had Katniss, Gale,
exactly.
Peter. Yes.
Yeah. The fact that we are hesitating over certain characters, people will be like,
have a big love triangle in there.
I could, except that I find love triangles excruciatingly frustrating to read, because I am really just that one, everlasting, untying, connecting of souls. Yeah, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, I love that.
But one point that I wanted to sort of circle back on about the romantasy genre that you touched on a little bit earlier was the taboo love, and the example kind of was Romeo and Juliet. I do feel like, though, in romantasy, there seems to be this, and I don't know if this is an actual official thing or if this is just sort of what is happening, but to be, I think, in that romantasy genre, especially with the romance part of it, there is this understanding that no main characters will die. It seems to be none of the great pivotal love stories. So there's not this fear of you losing these people and these people not having a happy ending. Romeo and Juliet obviously was a very tragic end, the most awful end. Whereas here, these books, it's almost like if you're going to be reading a romance, you need the happy ending. It needs to be guaranteed, because
absolutely.
You will
but they do. Some of them do die and come back, and I will never forget. I will never forget that scene.
Which one?
Was it? I've read it. So
with recent.
Yeah. I screamed in my bedroom, screamed someone that was very close to me. I had just received really tragic news. That was horrible. And because it was sort of my first sort of foray into this, I was like, can that happen in fantasy romance? That literally, that's it. I mean, I equally, spoiler alert, massive spoiler alert. I feel bad doing spoilers, but spoiler alert for The Fourth Wing. I felt equally as devastated, I think, with Liam when he went. So, yeah. But anyway, Rhys-Anne came back. It's all good. So you're right.
But I don't think it's not the same with Liam.
Prepare people that sometimes they just do die, and you will not be prepared for that moment. Yes.
But I don't think anyone and obviously it can happen because many of these series are unfinished, but I have not read any book across this genre that the main love story they've not ended up together at the end of the book, both alive.
I kind of want someone to do it and just shock everyone.
I think someone did. No, actually, I feel like if I didn't realize we'd be going here. Otherwise, I would have done some research, so I had some data. But it was on TikTok. So with all the hype around, you know, all the current releases, like SJM's about to release the next one in January. Iron Flame's just come out. Jennifer L. Armentrout just released, you know, another part of her series. There has been people saying, if, you know, Violet and Xaden are not endgame, I'm out. I'm done. Like, if Azriel doesn't end up with Elaine, or like if Azriel doesn't end up happy with a mate, if Moore doesn't end up with a female mate, like, there's people are just like, we are out. I mean, Azriel and Moore are secondary characters in a way that, you know, compared to, like, you know, Violence and Xaden, but that there was this whole thing when all these people were saying, you know, she would never do that. You know, Rebecca would not do us dirty like that. You know, SJM would not do us like that, because apparently there was an author that did that in this romantasy genre. There was this big book or a couple of a series, and she killed off someone. She killed off one of the lovers of the main, and people rioted. It was like, people have sworn off that author forever. They were like, I will never pick up another one of her books. And I can't remember who that author is, and I really think that
I'll do mine under a pen name, so then I can still release other books and still be beloved. Yeah, I think, you know, yeah, we're a passionate bunch. The readers are a passionate bunch, and we do like the happy ending, but that doesn't mean that in this fantasy world they can't die 10 times and come back. Like, that's cool. I love that. It's not real. They can come back. I'm sure they'll come back. But I will never forget that initial shock when that happened the first time. I was like, oh my lord, what's going on? So, anywho, we need to wrap. We need to wrap, my love. So, is there anything else you want to share about this genre? I think that gives people an idea of what it is about, but there is a spectrum of how fantastical and how magical, and I think that's cool because there's something for everyone in here to play with and to explore and to enjoy.
Yes, I think it's a nice way to kind of define what you're going to expect if you start reading them, that you will generally, 99% of the time, you will get happy endings, or you will at least have like a beautiful ending of main characters. You know, you will go on this journey. There will be, you know, some elements that are not of this world, but it's still pivotal around, you know, kind of a love story that has come together in a few fairly standard ways, but feels unique every time.
Absolutely.
Even if I'm like, yes, I know they hate each other, but my God, the sex is going to be amazing, and I can't wait till they fall in love. Yes.
And they do together.
So that's really all I wanted.
Very cool.
Yes. So I've just got the line, if we're finished, I've just got that line from a book to see if they can guess what book it is.
Yep, we're going to share a line, and you can just either just enjoy listening to Madge's dulcet tones as she shares it, or you can be like, where is that from, and try and guess it and let us know in our show notes, in our polls.
We would love you to guess it.
Yeah.
We would love you to guess it. Also, because I think I'm picking really iconic big lines, you know, lines that you would pull out and frame or put on a t-shirt, or, you know, I used in lots of social media, you know, posts. They will get more obscure, I think, once we know that people really are getting them. But I just wanted to start easy in a way. So the line this week from a book is, I would rather lose this entire war than live without you. And if that means I have to prove myself over and over, then I'll do it. You gave me your heart, and I'm keeping it.
Well, I'm not going to guess, but I hope that our listeners do. Thank you for listening to this episode. Really cool to just sort of flesh out this topic, and we will be seeing you in the next one. Thanks, Madge.
My pleasure. Until we chat again.
Goodbye. Thank you so much for listening. We hope that you felt like you were eavesdropping on a conversation that you have been dying to have with someone, to discuss all the tiny details and possible plot twists of the books that you've recently read. Perhaps you don't have someone to chat to after you finish one of those epic books, so please give the show a follow, and we would be honoured to be your book-obsessed friends. But mostly though, we hope it was fun. It gave you a giggle, it made you gasp, or encouraged you to pick up a different author.
please share it with someone who you think would also love it. And drop us a review, letting us know what you loved and what you want to hear from us in the future. We will be back with another episode soon. Happy reading.